On this edition of My America, Alex Newman on the crisis of public education and what we should be doing about it. Welcome to this new edition of My America. I'm Oliver North. Our guest today, Alex Newman. He's an award-winning international journalist, educator, author, speaker, and consultant. He's been published in the U.S. and abroad. Alex is happily married, has 5 children, and that alone would make him an expert on education. He currently splits time between various places. And Alex, today you're where?
I'm in Oklahoma City at a pastor's conference.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much for making time for us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you.
Alex, I've written a number of op-eds myself recently about the role of public education. I have 18 grandkids, so I've got a little focus of my life. They range in age from college sophomore down to diapers. So we're going to be in this for a while. What role should public education be playing in the lives of the American people?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I really think it's something that America as a whole needs to have a national discussion about. In my opinion, the government really should have very little to no role in the educating of our children. When I look at the Bible, I don't see any role for Caesar in the educating or discipling of children. To the extent that the American people do want some government role for education, I think really that needs to be something that's governed at the local level by a local school board that's accountable to the parents, kind of like it used to be, 100, 120 years ago. And I think really the role of the school is not to indoctrinate the children into critical race theory or communism or Marxism or fake history. To the extent that we are going to have public schools, they ought to be doing the basics, teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, teaching something about true American history, not the fraudulent version that has become all the rage, and just teaching children how to think. And I'm kind of old-fashioned. I believe that education and the Bible are inseparable, and so I think we should go back to pre-1960s when the children still had Bible, when they still prayed in the school. Because as I see it, all education is fundamentally religious in nature. It's a question of whose religion. Is it going to be Christianity, the religion that was held by virtually all of the founders, or is it going to be the new religion that has taken over, secular humanism, which is now kind of giving way to things as crazy in California as chanting to pagan Aztec deities? So.
Well, I go back to the point when Engel versus Vitale, I'm going to let you explain it to all of our listeners, but Engel versus Vitale was the seminal decision by the Supreme Court, at the Supreme Court level, of what was going on in the school system in which my dad was once the president of the Board of Education, upstate New York. And so in 1961, I graduated from high school, and I'm the last class that could pray in a public school in New York. Ultimately, it spreads across the country. My thinking is that things start to come off track right then. I can still remember the prayer that we used to say in public high schools, elementary schools, and it was commonplace, I think, around the country. Almighty Father, we thank you for your blessings for ourselves, our teachers, our country, our parents. Amen. That was it. And then we'd pledge allegiance to the flag in that order every single day. I look at that and say, that's where it all began to come off the tracks. Am I wrong?
You're absolutely right. And that decision, and then the one that followed in 1963, getting the Bible out of the schools, I think that was really the nailing of the final nails into the coffin of the American education system. For one, I think it shows you how dumbed down and ignorant of American history Americans had already become by the early 1960s. The idea that the Supreme Court would have the authority to overturn prayer or Bible reading in school is simply preposterous. They cited the First Amendment as their justification. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. Well, Congress hadn't made any laws. This was local school districts. As you said, New York, the 1962 case, it was local school districts. And the First Amendment, of course, was not designed for states and local districts. In fact, most of the states at the time the First Amendment was written and ratified actually had established churches. So I'm not arguing in favor of established churches. I'm saying it was an absolutely ludicrous decision. But I think the one guy who really hit the nail on the head, Justice Potter Stewart, who wrote the dissent in those cases, he explained perfectly what was going on. He said this denial of the right to do religious exercises in school is not the realization of a state of neutrality. In fact, he said this is the establishment of a religion of secularism. Now, I would say that it wasn't so much secularism as it was the humanism of John Dewey. Now, John Dewey is almost universally regarded as the founding father of our government school system, and he was a very religious man. He wrote out the first Humanist Manifesto with a couple dozen of his friends, and they said very clearly right there in the first tenet, we religious humanists believe the universe is self-existing and not created. That's a religious statement, right? Our founding fathers said it was self-evident that we were created and that God created us with rights and the government exists to protect those rights. So even if you're not a Christian, this has profound implications for our system of government, for our basic understanding of reality. And so this was a disaster that never should have happened. The American people right then and there should have said, Supreme Court, you do not have that authority. That is not what the U.S. Constitution says. And it's all been downhill from there.
Well, we're today, right, in Loudoun County, Virginia, the wealthiest per capita county in the country. And we're the place where a school teacher stood up at a public meeting. He was invited along with the rest of the community in a very large county to talk about what the budget was going to be and other things that mattered to the people. And what mattered to him was he was being told that to keep his job, he had to go, quote, neutral on the issue of gender.
I love all of my students, but I will never lie to them regardless of the consequences. I'm a teacher, but I serve God first, and I will not affirm that a biological boy can be a girl and vice versa, because it's against my religion, it's lying to a child, it's abuse to a child, and it's sinning against our God.
They fired him. His case was now going up through the process, the state Supreme Court. It's going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court eventually. And my sense is he's going to get his job back, or at least compensated for what he's done standing for the First Amendment. Am I wrong?
I suspect if there's any justice in the courts, he absolutely will not only get his job back, but be compensated for the harm that he was put through. But I think what you just described, we have similar things going on across the country. This illustrates the problem that we're dealing with. These schools are no longer neutral, if they ever were. Right? The idea of neutrality with respect to religion, as Justice Potter Stewart pointed out, is really not legitimate. It's either one or the other. And what this shows is that the schools have become overtly hostile to Christianity. It's not that they're just taking a neutral outlook and saying, you guys believe whatever you want. They're specifically training the children to believe things that are contrary to the faith of the majority of the American people. Something like 70+% of Americans describe themselves as Christians. And yet these same Christians are funding a school system that is overtly hostile to everything they believe, down to the most basic level, that God created male and female, marriage, the nature of reality. On every point, these schools are teaching the children things that are absolutely contrary to what the taxpayers believe. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the things that they're teaching the children today, I think would shock most parents. And fortunately, people are figuring this out now. And I see the outrage. I think that's a good thing. Hopefully, this will translate into some real positive action.
The United Nations, what's their role in educating people in America?
Well, it's been growing greater and greater, and we really saw this come to a head during the Obama administration. Of course, that's not where it began. But during the Obama administration, we had Arne Duncan serve 7 years as Secretary of Education. And this is a man who openly went to UNESCO, and he gave speeches, and he said, UNESCO, which is the UN's education agency, is my partner in global transformation of education. He said education is now a global public good. There can't be national boundaries anymore.
We stand with other champion countries, youth advocates, and partners to help advance the UN Global Education First Initiative's priorities to put every child in school, improve the quality of learning, and to foster global citizenship.
The UNESCO also has what they call the World Core Curriculum, which I encourage people to read it. It is absolutely bonkers, and yet top UN officials have said this should be taught in every school on the planet. So if you go all the way back to the founding of UNESCO after World War II, you see they've always had this fanatical desire to seize control of the education system. Right from the very beginning, they put in Julian Huxley as the first leader of UNESCO. The guy was the head of the Humanist Society and the head of the Eugenics Society. So we don't want the UN involved in our education system, but they are now, unfortunately, everywhere within it, not just in America, but around the world.
I've written about the People's Republic of China has their Confucius Institutes, trying to remind Americans about our civil liberties and the rest of it. Is that going to change?
Well, I would like to think so. Now, the Trump administration did take some action trying to rein in these Confucius Institutes. For those who aren't familiar, these are basically little outposts of the Communist Party of China that are setting up shop in our tax-funded educational institutions under the guise of teaching Chinese culture to American students. They're teaching no such thing. They're teaching communist culture. They are hotbeds of subversive activity, of espionage, and unfortunately now with the Biden administration, we just saw in the last few days, they dropped charges on a bunch of Chinese spies that they had lied on their visa applications. They were working for the People's Liberation Army. So we have a major problem when it comes to communist Chinese infiltration of our education system. And at this point, Colonel, we have the people who designed Common Core bragging in TV commercials that students in Shanghai and Beijing will be learning from the same set of standards as students in Chicago and St. Louis. I find that deeply problematic. American students in a free, self-governing republic based on biblical values really have no need for the kind of propaganda and indoctrination that they have in China, and vice versa. And yet they're bragging about this now. We've got to deal with this. It's not just a threat to our children and our educational system. It's a national security threat.
The IMF has created something over $600 billion in special drawing rights, SDRs. You've commented about that before, too.
I think this is one of the biggest unreported stories of the year by far. So the International Monetary Fund is now in the process of being transformed into kind of a proto-global central bank. The Biden administration and the Chinese communists are totally in favor of this. In fact, they've said so openly. And this $650 billion issuance of special drawing rights, think of it kind of like printing money, right? Like when the Federal Reserve creates a bunch of new money and they inject it into the economy by buying bonds. Right. That's what the IMF is doing, except with this international proto-global currency. And this is going to devalue our currency. It's going to transfer massive amounts of power and authority over to international institutions that are beyond democratic accountability. This is problematic on so many fronts. And I encourage people who are interested in the subject. We just published a cover story on this in the Epic Times that I wrote. I hope people will go read it. It's a hugely significant story, and you're not going to read about it very many places.
You're absolutely correct. By the way, I'm going to send you a copy of my new book, which is We Didn't Fight for Socialism. This is America's veterans who are now looking at the world in which they've served as volunteers in our armed forces and saying, I'm not even sure I want my own kids or grandkids to be serving. So I want to send you a copy of that because it's right along the lines of what you're saying here. One last quick question. The Soviets are gone. The Russians are still here. The People's Republic of China is now asserting itself globally. And one of the places where they've offered to help, be, quote, of help to the people is Cuba. And of course, they've already got property at both ends of the Suez Canal. They don't own the whole thing yet, but should we be concerned about all of this, particularly in a place like Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba?
We should be extremely concerned. And I'm really looking forward to reading your book because you're exactly right. But while the Biden administration is focusing on, flight suits for pregnant women and transgenderism in the military, Communist China is rapidly expanding its military power. They're building ships faster than we can decommission ours. I mean, this is a disaster waiting to happen. The Chinese and the Russians are very close allies. They are allied with the Cubans, with the Venezuelans, with the North Koreans. And of course, they have now taken over huge swaths of the United Nations. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, out of 15 specialized UN agencies, members of the Communist Chinese Party, right? Not just sympathizers, but members of the party are running 1/3 of them. To put that in perspective, an American runs just one of those agencies, and it's a rather useless one, the World Food Program, which really has very little power, influence, or authority. That's the problem that we're dealing with. The Communist Chinese are rapidly expanding to become not just a global superpower, but the global superpower. And it very much seems like the people in Washington running the federal government are aiding and abetting this process. It's incredibly dangerous for the sake of our children, for the sake of our national security, for the sake of our civilization. We have got to start paying attention to this.
Alex, you're spot on. Thank you very much for taking time to join us and reminding us all that this is a Christian nation.
Thank you so much for having me, Colonel. It's an honor and a real blessing to be with you.
If Alex's story has given you hope or inspired you to be a more actively engaged American, take time now to subscribe, comment, let me know, because you too can be part of the historical record of what it took to make this country sustain itself as a place for liberty and freedom and responsibility. And until next time, remember, Semper Fidelis is more than a slogan for U.S. Marines. Always faithful is a way of life. This broadcast has been brought to you in part by MyPillow and the MyPillow line of products. Get yours today at mypillow.com or 800-620-4439 and use promo code NORTH to receive deep discounts on your order.